Hey you guys, just a quick mention before we get started. I am a beginner, and this whole channel is about building a business, building guitars, and documenting everything that happens along the way. So you should probably take everything that I'm about to tell you with 2.5 pounds of salt. There are lots of mistakes that I make on a daily basis, but we learn from those mistakes, and this just goes to show you that just doing stuff is probably the best way to learn. Yeah, I have links to all the products that I've used in this video, to all the cameras in the description below, so feel free to check those out. Yeah, so just sit back and enjoy, I guess.
What is up, you guys? Kevin here with Javelin Guitars, and I'd like to welcome you to this here video series on how to operate a camera and sort of a buyer's guide on what you should look out for when buying a camera and that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in that, why don't you just stick around. So why am I making this video? As you might already know, I'm a contestant in the Great Guitar Build-Off 2021, and by now there's a lot of people who have already uploaded their stuff to YouTube. Now, while all the guitars that you are able to see there look awesome, and there's some really great concepts at work, I don't think I can compete in any way build-wise. What I've noticed is that a lot of people seem to have troubles or not a lot of thought put into the video aspect of things. Now, Ben Crow already had this sort of mini tutorial when he announced the Great Guitar Build-Off, but I thought I'd do this sort of PSA kind of thing where I'm going to tell you what to look out for if you decide to go down the route of having something a bit more representative in terms of image quality and audio and video, all that sort of stuff in general. Now, this is going to be a long one, so I'll have timestamps down in the description in case you want to skip over any of the parts. I've made myself a little cheat sheet. It's only about 7 pages long, so that I hope I don't forget anything. First of all, who is this video aimed towards? This series is kind of aimed towards those people who like to do some workshop or woodworking stuff, and coincidentally that really has a lot of the same things that you would look for if you do vlogging. Now, before you just go ahead and dive right into this whole video subject, camera gear, there might be a few things that you would like to consider first beforehand. The first thing that you want to have a really clear vision about is, what do you want to do? Is it going to be woodworking or shooting yourself in a workshop with a camera, that is? Do you want to do vlogs? Do you want to shoot yourself cooking? Whatever it is you want to do, there's going to be certain aspects that you will be looking for in a camera. And then, of course, there is the question of what are you going to need? If you're going to do some woodworking stuff, you'll probably want a camera that's dust sealed and waterproof, stuff like that. Of course, the question of how much are you going or are you willing to spend on camera gear. Let's just assume it's as little as possible, because this might not be the main focus of your business, but it's certainly gonna help present your business in a more appealing manner. And lastly, do you really want to go down this route? Because you're not only going to shoot videos, which is time consuming, you'll be reviewing your footage, you'll be editing your footage, you'll be cutting and color grading and whatnot. You'll be rendering and exporting your footage, and of course you're going to upload all the stuff to YouTube, and then you're going to have to manage with all the comments and all the viewer interactions. So all of that is really time consuming, and that's just gotta be something that you have to factor in. So know what you're getting yourself into, and it'll make your life a whole lot easier. So that brings us to the first main section of the video, which is the type of camera that you're looking for. Now we all have something like this in our pockets. It's a smartphone. Right now I'm using the remote control app to control the camera that I'm shooting this with. But you might as well just go ahead and use your smartphone as a camera. Second option, that's your typical camcorder. You know, those handheld things that you have lots of VHS tapes at your parents' house. You always have to watch that junk when your family comes over for the holidays. And lastly, you could get yourself a little camera, DSLR, mirrorless camera, something like this. Interchangeable lens system, which is what most content creators here on YouTube and Instagram choose to go for. And there's a few reasons why these are so popular. So let's start out with the smartphone. It's the year 2021 and most smartphones actually have super high-end camera specs. Most of them you can shoot 4K footage, some of them even in 60p or 120p. You have lots of control over the image quality. You have a nice wide angle lens built into the smartphone, so you could just hold it out like that and bam, you're vlogging. Could be as simple as that. One of the big downsides to using a smartphone though is that they have a really tiny sensor, which means that once you're not in direct sunlight or it's overcast and you're outside, the image can break up real easily, meaning that there's gonna be lots of grain in the image. It's not gonna look sharp. I mean, just take a photo at night and try to make that look good. It's probably not gonna happen unless you have a nice lighting setup. And of course, the main reason for video and me not using a smartphone is that the smartphones that I've used, I'm sure there's others out there and you can buy camera apps and whatnot, is that you don't have any real control over the camera itself once you start the record button on videos. In my case, using the Samsung S6, which is a bit dated, but it can shoot 4K in 30p and Full HD in 60p. You have a Pro feature on here, and it seems like you can set the shutter, you can set the ISO, you can put on filters and whatnot. But once you hit that record button on video, it just switches to full automatic, and it just does whatever the hell it wants. That's why I would not recommend a smartphone if you want a nice looking image and you want a nice consistent look throughout all of the videos that you'll be producing over time. Camcorders. I have the Sony AX53 to test out for this whole situation here, and I've shot some test footage, and it's really nice actually, because there's not a whole lot you have to do. You just flip out the screen, the thing turns on, you can press record, and then you can just record. Shoots 4K, but even here, you're limited to basically full automatic unless you get something that's over $1,000. You're supposed to have manual control over all the separate functions, but really when you start setting up things, there's really only one value that you can change to manual at a time. Be it the shutter speed or white balance, manual exposure, all that sort of stuff. And also because you have a fixed lens on the camcorder and quite a tiny sensor still, you won't be able to get some sort of nice cinematic looks by blurring the background and stuff like that. So you'll pretty much have a similar image quality as you would with a smartphone. Only I doubt that you have a camcorder laying around. Now, of course, you could go cinema camcorder, and if that's your jam, all power to you. But if that were the case, I don't think you'd be watching this video right here. And the third type of camera is an interchangeable lens camera, DSLR or mirrorless camera. In my case, I really love the Lumix cameras, and the great thing about these is that you have full control over every feature and every value at all times, unless of course you switch to full automatic and then you don't have to think about anything. Also, these cameras have a really big sensor compared to smartphones and camcorders, so you're able to work with a shallow depth of field depending on the lens that you slap on the front. You'll be able to choose multiple frame rates and resolutions, and you can pretty much customize the image to anything you want. Downside to that is that once you dive into the whole system, it can get pretty complicated and time consuming. And money consuming as well, because you not only have to factor in the body, which is just this thing right here, just a box with a sensor, but you also have to factor in the lens. And these bad boys can get pretty expensive. But there are cheap options out there that produce a great image quality, and I want to help you decide what to look for in this pretty big camera market. So this is where we start with the second part of the video, which is how to actually shoot video. Now, when shooting video or even just taking photos, what you want to look out for is the proper exposure. Now, the exposure basically consists of three things that you have to factor in. First, there's the ISO. Now, the ISO value is just responsible for how sensitive to light the sensor is going to be and how bright the overall image is going to be. Second is going to be aperture. Aperture is built into the lens, and if you've ever looked at a lens a bit closer, you'll see that there's like this small ring that gets smaller and bigger. That's the aperture. It opens and closes and determines how much light you let into the camera or hit the sensor. Now, if you open up the aperture really wide, a lot of light comes in and there's only a little plane for you to really sharply focus on, and the rest is going to be out of focus, which gives you that depth of field, blurry background look. Now, closing up the aperture is going to let in less light, but it's going to sharpen the overall image. But you won't be able to get any blurry background. Or maybe you will, but just at a really long focal length. And the third part of the exposure is going to be the shutter speed. Single lens reflex, you know, like those click click old cameras or even DSLRs that have a viewfinder on top. You can look through the camera and there's a mirror in front of the sensor, and once you hit that release button, the shutter release, the mirror flips up, you open the shutter and the sensor is exposed to light, and then the shutter closes again, and whatever hit the sensor in that short amount of time is then saved and processed as the image that you will see in camera. Now, shutter speed is going to determine how you capture motion. You might have noticed that when you put a movie on pause, the still image is not really sharp. Everything's kind of blurry, which you don't really notice once the film is rolling, and that's because there's a certain rule of which shutter speed to set your camera to when shooting videos, if you want it to look as good as it can be. Now, you can set the shutter speed to a higher number, and that will mean that the shutter will expose the sensor of the camera to less light and therefore making the image sharper, but we're talking about motion picture here. And if you set the shutter speed too high, if you set the shutter speed too high, the motion you're trying to capture is going to look all jittery because every frame is sharp and you don't have any motion blur. And motion blur really is your friend in this situation. So how do you determine what values to set your camera to if you want a proper exposure? Okay, so proper exposure. How do we go about this? Now, let me preface this by saying that there's no real proper or improper way to expose your image. If you like what you see, you might be good just to stick with it. But if you want your image to look like something that is generally accepted as aesthetic, there are a couple of rules of thumb that you can go by. Now, what I like to do is start out with how I want the picture to look. So do I want a nice depth of field? Do I want that blurry background? Like when I'm shooting these talking head sections, the background is a bit blurry, so there's more focus on me. Or am I shooting something like a sports event where you want to actually capture all the motion and you're not concerned about the blurriness or the out of focus areas of your image? So I like to base everything off the first setting, which is going to be your aperture, which determines your depth of field. Right now I'm shooting wide open f2.0. From that point forward, I want to set the shutter speed. And for something that's not high action, where you don't need the high frame rates, etc., you're going to want to set your shutter speed to double of what your frames per second are, or the closest that you can get to double. So right now I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, so I want to set the shutter to 1/60th of a second. That way I get a nice motion blur when things are moving, and it looks all natural when movement is displayed. And the last thing you want to do is check if your image is bright enough, and you do that by adjusting the ISO setting. And it's as simple as that. Now if you notice that your image is still too bright, you can screw on an ND filter on the front of the lens, which is a neutral density filter, which is pretty much like fancy sunglasses for your camera. And if it's too dark, but you have your shutter speed where you want it to be and you have the aperture where you want it to be, you'll probably want to get something like these video lights right here. See? That's the light source. And if you want your image to be consistent all throughout your videos, you'll have something like you should shoot your videos in the same space all the time and have one single light setup that you can just turn on and start shooting. Another great option if you're outdoors and you're vlogging is get a variable ND filter, which has a screw mechanism, and by screwing the front element of that filter, the opacity increases or decreases, making your image either brighter or darker. So much for the exposure of your picture. Now, why is it important to check on the exposure? Because if something's underexposed, there's only so much that you can do in post-production to brighten the image without it falling apart completely. And if it was captured overexposed and there's too much highlights, the detail within the area of those highlights might have been lost completely, and you won't be able to save your image no matter how much post-production you put into it, because there's no data in these areas that were overexposed. And to help along in this process, different cameras from different manufacturers have different features or options to help you determine whether your image is properly exposed or not. Now, if you've taken a look at the market, you might have noticed that there's a lot of cameras to choose from. And if you're new to this whole thing, you might be overwhelmed. So where do we start? So if you're a woodworker or a vlogger, it can actually get pretty simple, because we make dust. So we're going to need a camera that is going to be able to withstand being exposed to all the dust from sanding or from planing, unless you've got a super fancy extraction system, and you don't need to worry about that. If you're a vlogger, you're going to need a camera that can withstand rain and possibly cold temperatures, or in general just climate changes. So in factoring that in, we need a camera that's dust and splash proof, or at least a camera that has a dust cover readily available without having to order it from China. So if we're looking for that in a camera, that pretty much eliminates most of the competition and leaves us with a couple of cameras that might be interesting for our cause. But those are going to be the cameras that I have here with me. Those are going to be the Panasonic Lumix G81, representing the whole G series of Lumix cameras. We're going to have the Sony Alpha 6000, representing the whole APS-C lineup of Sony Alpha cameras. We're going to have the Canon 250D, or SL3 I think it's called, which is going to represent budget level Canon cameras. We're going to be looking at the Fuji X-T200. We're going to be looking at the Nikon Z50. We'll have the Samsung S6 smartphone just for the heck of it. And because I was really interested in the image quality and performance, I also got a camcorder, which is the Sony AX53. Now there's pros and cons to each and every camera, and I've done a sort of log test to help compare one system to another and experience those drawbacks, those pros and cons, and the features in a live situation. And because I'm not predominantly like an outdoor vlogger, this might just be the sort of stuff that you might start out with if you're sort of inexperienced in this field. To try and keep it as fair as possible, I've tested out all these cameras with the corresponding kit lens, and I've tried to keep it as budget friendly as possible. Starting out with a kit that comes in somewhere around the $500 mark, and if you're willing to spend a bit more, we've hit somewhere near the $1,000 mark. That is pretty much the price range that we're talking about if we want to start looking at more professional or semi-professional camera gear. So let's take a look at some examples, some cameras that I had lying around, and compare those to one another and see if that might help you in deciding which type of camera you might want to get.
And we're recording. Just got out of my car. I was promised a nice view from over here. Hope to test out all the cameras that I have with me to compare the picture quality and if they're suited for this style of video. Don't expect any super fancy whatever the hell stuff, B-roll. Starting off recording with just a smartphone. Thing about smartphones is they usually have pretty good video specs, actually. And this is the front lens of the smartphone. And unfortunately, this is the only way that you'll be able to see yourself while filming. And the front-facing camera is usually a lot worse than the back-facing camera. Something that also sucks about consistent video quality with a smartphone, that once you start recording video, you're basically limited to full automatic. Fuck, I'm out of shape. Also on the front camera, from what I can tell, there's no image stabilization. This is a smartphone, Samsung S7. It's a couple of years old, but it has 4K capabilities. Let's switch to 2K. This is 1080p, and let's see how well 2K works. So we're now in 2K. It's already cropped in. I have my arm extended all the way, but it's more than sufficient angle-wise. Thing that nobody tells you is that you have all these cameras with flip-out screens, and actually all the cameras I got for this review have flip-out screens except for the Sony A6000. What nobody tells you is that if you're in the sunlight, like I am right now, it doesn't really matter if you have a screen or not, because you can't see shit on it. It's like driving in direct sunlight with a dirty windshield. Yeah, but this is the Samsung S6 front-facing camera in 2K. Yeah, so let's switch up. I've got my trusty G81 or G85 for all you North Americans out there. Let's see how well that one goes. Okay, so we are now on the Lumix G81/G85, the G80 models. And one thing that I noticed right off the bat, that it's a lot heavier than a smartphone. Okay, so this is the kit lens. Well, there's several kit lenses, but this is sort of their premium option kit lens, I guess. The 12-60, 3.5 to 5.6. This is at aperture 3.5. I am filming in full HD, 60p. Now it looks like I'm blown out. Should be a little bit better. And to maintain that shutter speed, I have to screw on an ND filter, which is basically like putting a pair of sunglasses on your camera lens. I think I still have the image stabilization deactivated. Now it's too dark. That's the thing about these filters, that you constantly need to change them if you're out in the wild like I am. I also have to try and remember to look at the camera lens rather than the flip-out screen, because as awesome it might be to see yourself, once you've set the image, you should basically just flip the screen back to not get tempted to look at the screen all the time, because now I'm looking at the camera lens, now I'm looking at the screen. Now I'm looking at the camera lens, now I'm looking at the screen. Looking at the camera screen rather than the lens causes a disconnect between me and you guys, which is also one of the reasons why I think these flip-out screens are actually overrated. In fact, let me just flip it back in. I have my reflection on the lens cap hood on the filter. I can see myself pretty clearly, better than on the screen actually. And if everything works out, I should actually be right in the middle of the frame. Yeah, there's a lookout over here. Let's see if we can get some B-roll footage. That's the G81 for you guys. See what else I have in my bag of goodies. and I'll be right back to you guys in a sec. Okay, we're recording. Now, this camera at least has a picture profile that looks interesting. I'm using the kit lens on all of these, and this kit lens happens to have a filter threading of 40.5 millimeters, which I don't have a step-up ring for. I stopped down the aperture to f13 like a jackass, and here I am, no flip-out screen, and I'm vlogging with this thing. Yeah, exposed to direct sunlight, stop down like a jackass, but the proper shutter angle, yeah. This is the Sony Interchangeable Lens Camera E-Mount Alpha 6000, camera of the year 2014. Still available, since it seems to be such a great camera. Got a nice view in the back. We're recording at 50 frames per second, 1080p, which is all this camera can do. I just figured out that I still have this thing on auto white balance, so how's that working out? Still walking around here trying to find the place that I was looking for, but it seems kind of nice over here. I mean, you can still hear the highway in the background, so that's a bummer. This is the Sony Alpha 6000, no flip out screen, just looking at the camera lens. No ND filter, just stop down the aperture to, I think I'm getting fuzzy shit around my mouth. I somehow feel like I took a wrong turn at some point. Let's keep going and see where we end up with the next camera. Okay, I finally had it figured out. Flip out the screen. Okay, we're in 4K, 24p. This one kind of had me excited because I think it's one of the sexiest cameras out there. This camera body, at least, is one of the sexiest things out there. Dude, overexposure. This is the Fuji X-T200. Now, the operation of the camera, if you're not used to it, is kind of awkward, I think. I'm pretty used to shooting on Canon and of course on Panasonic Lumix cameras, but this one had me confused. In 4K, 24p, kit lens, autofocus engaged, and it seems to be tracking my face rather nicely. Has a huge ass screen, at least compared to the other cameras. Usually one of those flip out screens is like 3 inches, and this one is 3.5. Did I just go in a fucking circle? Think so. Sun in the back. Lens flares. This is the cinema. I welcome you to it. Let's switch to 1080p. By the way, we're limited to 15 minutes recording in 4K mode. Okay, once we switch to 1080p, we're limited to 30 minutes. I think it is a bit wider, the image. So there is a crop in 4K. But the autofocus seems to work just fine. I always have this green box around my face. It's a nice big screen, and it actually works in direct sunlight. I can still see everything. So that's pretty cool. So this seems to be a fine little camera. Unfortunately, it feels very plasticky because it's just a plastic body. Navigating the menus with this is kind of a bitch because there's no arrow buttons, there's no control wheel on the back, whatever, there's this little joystick. And by little, I actually mean tiny. It's like you took a toothpick, sanded the top flat. That's about the size of the joystick that you have right here. Yeah, and when you press on the joystick to select an option, it kind of feels like pressing on the lid of a glass of marmalade or jam, jelly, whatever. Fruit spread. Kind of feels like the whole camera body is being pushed inwards and as if it were completely hollow. I mean, there's upsides to that because this camera is really light. So I have the image stabilization turned off. Let's turn it on and see how well this bad boy performs. From what I can tell, there's two options in this camera. There's the digital image stabilizer and we have a digital gimbal. This is the digital image stabilizer activated. This is with the digital gimbal. That's interesting. I'm limited to 30 frames per second and there's a huge ass crop on the image. So that's kind of useless. Does the image look better? See those weird camera movements? So it captures a 4K image and digitally crops into the image to keep the focus, to keep the frame where it is. That's the digital gimbal. Okay, I get it. Yeah, so that's the Fuji X-T200. I kind of like it. It's kind of expensive at 850 euros, including a kit lens. There's cheaper options, but this thing has nice autofocus. Now it detects my eye. It can actually shoot in 120p, so you can have some awesome slow-mo footage. It actually works rather nicely. No weather sealing though. That's kind of a bummer. So, let's check out the next camera. We've arrived at our destination. Let's look at what we can capture now. Okay, here's something else. Doing something handheld. And there's where we need to go. Maybe this could reveal what I'm looking at. Ooh, what's that? Unseren Gefallenen. To our fallen. Yeah, so let's see how this thing performs. This is the Sony AX53 camcorder. Spec-wise, probably the worst out of the bunch of cameras that I have, but maybe the image quality can make up for that. Better stabilization? I don't know. Let's see what we can get out of this little baby. Boo, 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 boo. Would you look at that? I'm all alone. Good thing I don't have a mask with me. Oh boy, this sucks. Okay, so now we're on something that I should potentially be more akin to. This is the Canon 250D, and it has digital image stabilization activated, dual pixel autofocus. We're currently recording at 1080p, 50 frames per second, and it's cropped in like fuck. Let's change the stabilization. Same thing, no stabilization. So that's what this looks like. Yeah, pretty boring up there. So no real use in going up there, actually. It's locked onto my face, has eye detection. Dude, this is horrible. Can't see enough stuff on the screen. You can barely make anything out, but there's no exposure levels. I can see that I'm at ISO 100. I know that I'm at 50p, so I've got my shutter set to 100th of a second. Got the ND filter screwed on, and it looks like everything's okay, but there's no zebras, there's no highlights, nothing really on there that could help you get the kind of picture that you'd want or need. The image stabilization actually has two settings. It's a slight image stabilization, which crops in a little bit, and there's the enhanced stabilization, which essentially gives you the same amount of crop that you'd have on the 4K setting. So let's go through all those things one after another. Okay, so this is the slight image stabilization, or I should say regular image stabilizer. Cropped in, but it's still doable. Not that I'd like it like that, but then again, we're just using the kit lens. So let's switch to enhanced stabilization. So this is the enhanced stabilization, and I'm really hoping that we can pair this with 4K recording. That would be so funny to see. You can only have my eye in the frame, something like that. Yeah, this is the 250D enhanced stabilization, 50p, 1080p. Eye detect autofocus still works. Got my arm stretched out all the way. My face is still in the frame completely, but there's no way of me adding those black bars. That way my head would be out of frame or not in the frame completely. So let's see if we can use the stabilizer in 4K. Okay, so we're in 4K 24p. We no longer have the dual pixel autofocus capabilities, so the autofocus is contrast based, so it's probably gonna skip around a whole lot. It does see my face though, and it's trying to focus on that. But I can hear the step motor on the lens going haywire. So 4K, no stabilization. Let's crop it in a bit further because I think the image is a bit too wide. 4K recording, 25p, image stabilization engaged, and we have a slight crop on the image. Whoa. Yeah, that is some great focusing capabilities. People complain about Panasonic, but I think this is still too wide of an angle. So let's pop in the enhanced image stabilizer. Okay, so now I have my arm out all the way. We're in 24p, overexposed. (24p), enhanced image stabilization, minimum focal distance, so this is the whole 18 millimeters, but just look at how far that's cropped in. Yeah, and the focus is really unusable at this point. Combine that with the shadows and the sunlight popping in and out of frame. Canon really do make the best cameras out there. We've got ourselves an airplane. So that's that. A couple of different cameras. A first attempt at vlogging of sorts, at least doing some... let me change that frame rate. So we're back in 1080p. There's some horses over here. Let's see if we can capture some of those. Having it zoomed in using the kit lens shuts the aperture down to 5.6, so there's absolutely no blurry background. Yeah, so that's that. And this is the full glory of the Canon 250D or SL3. It's actually the one I enjoy the least out of all the cameras that I've had with me. Yeah, so congratulations, Canon. You've wielded the cripple hammer and made use of its full potential. You. Okay, so what did we learn from all this vlogging of outstanding quality, and even more so, my skills of color grading, which are just out of this world? Well, to be honest, it wasn't really that much. But enough to hopefully save you the hassle of buying all these cameras yourself, only to realize that the camera you just got in the mail sucks and really doesn't suit your needs. Because let's face it, being out in the field and testing a camera in the real world is infinitely more valuable than comparing spec sheets to one another. Getting lost in the numbers, changing your mind along the way, and forgetting about what you set out to do in the first place. So let's dive into my evaluation and comparison of all these cameras back to back, sharing with you the experience that I made in the couple of weeks that I was able to test out these cameras, and let you know which camera I chose in the end, and maybe you might too, because the reason why my decision went down the way it did is because of one single feature that's usually not mentioned anywhere. So let's dive right into it. Start out with the smartphone, of which I couldn't remember the name before, but it's actually the Samsung Galaxy S7. Not the S6, it's the S7. Okay, so just real quick some specs. The S7 sports a 12 megapixel sensor. It can shoot 4K in up to 30 frames per second, 2K in up to 30 frames per second, and 1080p with up to 60 frames per second. Now when shooting 1080p without the 60 FPS option, you're able to reap the benefits of tracking autofocus, and if that's your thing, HDR shooting, which stands for high dynamic range. So if you're shooting in difficult conditions, like straight into the sunlight or something, the camera will be able to handle that a lot better and have at least some details left in the sky, and you as the subject won't be completely black. But when actually shooting a video, HDR is pretty much something that I don't consider using at all. It can be neat for photos though. Now I read somewhere on the radio that the autofocus technology that Samsung utilizes in their Galaxy range of smartphones is supposed to be in one way or another Canon's dual pixel autofocus tech, but don't quote me on that. And also something where you can find kind of contradictory information is about the image stabilization, which according to different sources works in both the rear camera and the front-facing camera. That will be an optical image stabilization acquired by shifting the sensor to accommodate the motion. But you saw the footage, so who knows. When the camera is turned on, you have the option of swiping from left to right to access the so-called Pro mode. And in this Pro mode, you have the ability to change the ISO value, you have the ability to change the shutter speed, you can change the white balance, you can change from autofocus to manual focus and actually pull focus with your finger, and there's a couple of filters that you can add, which work pretty much like a picture profile on all other cameras. Nothing you could really customize, but it's there. All that goes for the rear camera. In the front-facing camera you can shoot 2K with 30 FPS and 1080p with 30 FPS, and you'll be limited to full automatic shooting. As of now, the Samsung S7 is out of production, but thanks to the internet you can buy anything from anywhere. Now there's pros and cons to the system, and the pros obviously being that you probably already have a smartphone in your pocket right now. Maybe it's in your hands while you're watching me talk. The video specs themselves are actually pretty good, and the image quality itself is pretty great, let's be honest. Plus you have the added benefit of not worrying about your shoulder wearing out because the smartphone is really light. You can hold it out like that for days before your arm starts getting sore. So why even consider buying a different camera? And this is where it starts to get interesting, because all these great specs that I just named only apply to the rear camera. Which means that if you want to shoot yourself, as in a vlogging situation, or when you're in your workshop and you have no one there to assist you to frame the image, there's no way that you can actually see yourself while using all the pro features. Because on the front-facing camera, which is the camera you want to use to be able to see yourself on the smartphone screen, only works in full automatic. Smartphones have a tiny sensor and therefore don't really work when you're in sub-ideal lighting conditions. The image is just gonna fall apart, you'll have lots of noise, even if noise reduction is applied to the image. It's gonna be all grainy, there's not gonna be much detail in the shot, and you'll probably end up throwing it out the window, both the shot and the smartphone. So that's the Samsung S7 for you. Next up in the comparison is the Panasonic Lumix G80 series, which here in Europe is the G81 and in North America it's known as the G85. I'll be referring to this camera here from this point out as the G80. So the G80 comes with a 16 megapixel sensor, which is in the micro four thirds format. So out of all DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, this is the smallest sensor that you can get. It can shoot 4K in 24p and in 30p, and it can shoot 1080p in 24 frames per second, 25, 30, 50 and 60 frames per second. You also have the option of having high shutter speeds, but are then only limited to 720p. It has a fully articulating 3-inch LCD display, a mic input, an accessory or flash mount hot shoe, whatever you want to call it. It has contrast-based autofocus with face detection and a 5-axis sensor shift optical image stabilization built into the camera body, which can be coupled with the image stabilization of your lens, giving you a couple extra stops of stabilization, which in my experience really eliminates the need for a gimbal. So that's that. The LCD is completely touch sensitive, so you can navigate the menu with just your finger. All the buttons and dials are completely programmable, so that if you have the screen flipped out and pointed towards you, you can pretty much change every value with just the tip of your finger. You have 2 different custom modes that you can set up completely and call upon quickly by the turn of a dial. So you can set C1 mode to 4K 24p if you're shooting an interview or a speech. And then for all the B-roll shots you want to take, you can have C2 and 1080p with 60 frames per second. You can set up different picture profiles, and you have an array of exposure assistance tools, like a grid overlay, focus peaking for manual focus, a histogram if you're into that, and zebras for showing overexposed areas within the picture. Also on the screen you have displayed the mic levels, so you can always keep track of all the variables that go into making the image look the way you want it to. If you want to check out the prices, I have links in the description where you can check out all the gear that I used and all the cameras in this example. So what are the biggest pros to this camera? It's high customizability, it has pretty good bit rates with 4K running up to 100 megabits per second. It has great image quality and pretty much all the stuff that I said before. Now what are the cons to owning a Lumix camera, specifically the G80? The autofocus, and this is the main reason why people don't like the Lumix cameras, is contrast based. By now it's a pretty outdated technology, and you can see that in the picture because you'll constantly see some pulsing in the background where the background gets blurry and then kind of sharp again. That's because the autofocus is constantly searching for something to focus on and doesn't really stick to anything for longer periods of time. And another drawback to using the Lumix cameras is that Another drawback to using Lumix cameras is that they're actually pretty heavy compared to other cameras. So if you're looking for something that's highly portable, getting something from the G series of Lumix might not be the best idea, and you might want to check out something else. So keep that in mind. Next up in this roster of cameras is the Sony Interchangeable Lens Camera E-Mount ILCE Alpha 6000. Now this one's been around forever. It was the camera of the year 2014, and throughout the vlog test you might have noticed why. It's a super crisp and super sharp image, and this was just using the kit lens and stopped down like a maniac because I didn't have a step-up ring to put an ND filter on the front of the lens. Now the A6000 comes with a whopping 24 megapixels and an APS-C sensor, which is right in the middle between a micro four thirds and a full frame sensor. You pretty much add half the diameter of the micro four thirds sensor and you get something along the lines of APS-C. Most of the cameras sub $1,000
colors actually use an APS-C sensor, so on paper it's gonna work better in low light situations. It comes with a 3-inch tilting monitor, so no flip out screen, and it can't be tilted up over the camera or down where you could still see yourself. So the only option you have is looking at the front of the lens and hope for the best. Or buying yourself a field monitor and setting that on top so you then have an image to look at. Those are nice to have, but they come at an extra cost, so you gotta weigh that out. It comes with phase detect autofocus, which is super quick and super reliable, which is the reason why it's become one of the industry leading autofocus technologies. Comes with a hot shoe and you have an HDMI output. You can use some assist tools like a histogram and focus peaking. It comes with a whole bunch of different picture profiles, including one that you can customize yourself, and most notably you can shoot in the XAVCS Cinelike profile, which is a really nice and flat picture profile, which is just screaming to be color graded. Not that I'd know anything about that. Now unfortunately this camera only shoots 1080p and only at 25 frames per second and 50 frames per second. Current prices are in the link in the description. So the pros to this system are that this camera is really light and portable. The kit lens is really small and you can pretty much just fit the whole camera inside your jacket pocket. And whenever you see something that you'd like to shoot, you just pull it out and off you go. It's the cheapest out of all these cameras and it has some great codecs and picture profiles, especially the XAVCS Cinelike, which I enjoy just a little bit too much. And what are the cons? Well, first and foremost, it only shoots in 1080p and only has 2 different frame rates to choose from. Now you can still use the 50 FPS mode and drag it out in your timeline to get some slow motion footage, but I like shooting most of my stuff in 24p, and if I do slow-mo shots, I use 60 FPS and have Premiere Pro interpret the footage as 24p, and that will give you super smooth slow motion. Something that may just count for me. To shoot video you have to press the designated video record button, and that's awkwardly placed on the grip of the camera, so you have to awkwardly move your thumb over and press that button. You might not care about that at all, but I find the handling kind of weird. For me that's a big turn off. And also by not having a flip out screen or flip up or flip down, you pretty much have to anticipate what your shot looks like and just hope for the best, because you can't see yourself. So that's the Sony Alpha 6000. It's a nice and fun little camera. Next up we have the Fujifilm X-T200. Now as I said before, this one had me excited, but Fujifilm in general has me excited. I started out shooting on actual film, and I always enjoyed the Fujifilm cartridges over Ilford or Kodak and some other stuff that's out there. And the Fuji lineup really just has the looks to go with that aesthetic of analog shooting, which I totally dig. So let's check out the X-T200, which is Fuji's mid-range entry into the camera market. Now the X-T200 comes with a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. It has a 3.5-inch fully articulating LCD screen, which really makes a big difference compared to all the other 3-inch screens. It might not sound like much, but you really feel that half-inch out in the field. That's what she said. You have a hot shoe for mounting accessories, a mic input, an HDMI out, and if you're somewhat familiar with the classic Fujifilm cartridges, you'll be delighted to find all these film simulations built in. Though my take on that is just a fancy way of marketing, since those profiles really are just your standard, vivid, natural, etc. profiles, which you can find on almost any camera nowadays. It shoots 4K and 30p, 25p and 24p, with a recording limit of 15 minutes, and it shoots 1080p in 60, 50, 30, 25 and 24 frames per second. You also have the option of in-camera slow motion footage, which is all gonna happen in 1080p, and you can slow down your footage 2, 4 and 5-fold. 2, 4, 5, 2, 4, 5. And you can slow down your image 2, 4 and 5-fold. Now the pros to using this camera, of course, is gonna be the vintage looks and the entire experience of shooting with this camera, which really feels nostalgic. And if you really want to somewhat translate the whole emotional part of shooting on film into the digital world, this is probably your best shot.
maybe next to medium format photography. So you have all these film simulations, and when shooting in 4K you actually have little to no crop. I didn't notice any, and the manual doesn't state any significant crop, so I guess there really wasn't any. You have an awesome range of frame rates to choose from, and what I really liked is being out in direct sunlight, having that huge ass screen to flip out, and you can still see everything on screen. Even though it's only an LCD, I don't know what they do with their screens that other manufacturers don't, but this is how you make a screen. Awesome stuff! Now, since there's no such thing as a perfect camera, there are cons to this system. Most notably for me is that it feels really cheap and plasticky. It's really light, which doesn't feel reassuring in the durability of the camera. And as I said before, you have that little joystick, and when you press down on it to select an option, it really feels like the whole camera is caving in. And you're only gonna be able to use that joystick for a set amount of time. I don't know, maybe 20. You don't have the option to choose a custom picture profile, and since Fuji's most popular profile, Eterna, is missing from this camera, the ones you get to choose from are very saturated and extremely contrasty, which is a look in itself, but you gotta really like it, and I just happen not to. The menu navigation is a nightmare, especially since you have all the dials on the top of the camera, and when shooting photos you can change every value really easily. But once you're shooting video, you can really only change the aperture and the shutter, but to change the ISO, you gotta open the menu, find the ISO value somewhere in there, select it using the joystick, worry that the camera is gonna break between your fingers, select a different ISO setting, and press enter to see if it works out once you resume the live view mode. If it doesn't, you gotta repeat that process until you eventually find the value that works for you. There's no optical image stabilization. You have the electronic IS, but that doesn't really work that well. And you have that utterly useless digital gimbal thing. So you gotta find some way to stabilize your image, which is pretty much just gonna suck. That's the X-T200 by Fujifilm for you guys. Now the next camera I'm gonna talk about I didn't have with me during the vlog, just because that's why. And that is gonna be the Nikon Z50, or as some people call it, the Z50. Now if you want to speak English, you gotta speak English correctly. And I for one have never heard of the band ZZ Top. So just one pro argument for American English, even if it's with a heavy German accent. Okay, so the Nikon Z50. Looks really good on paper, and also in real life. There's something about that red stripe on the grip that just looks good. As far as the spec sheet goes, the Z50 comes with a 21 megapixel APS-C sensor, an articulating 3.2-inch screen, not fully articulating mind you, gonna be able to flip out to the back. You can flip it to the bottom actually, which is something you don't really see every day. But you can see yourself and it works pretty nicely. It has a hot shoe, has a mic input, a mic output, which is great for monitoring your audio if you're not busy standing in front of the camera, has an HDMI out, the body is weather sealed, meaning it's dust and splash proof, and it uses a hybrid autofocus mechanism which combines contrast and phase detect autofocus. Now in terms of image quality, you can record 4K images in 30, 25 and 24 FPS, as well as 1080p in 120, 100, 60, 50, 30, 25 and 24 frames per second. So that's the most out of the whole lot of cameras that I've had. Additionally, you have in-body slow motion, meaning that you won't have to rely on post-production to slow down that footage. The camera is gonna do that for you. Unfortunately, like all the other cameras that have this capability, is that that's only gonna happen without audio, which is a huge bummer. At least in terms of point and shoot stuff. Now the pros to the Z50, apart from the mouth-watering design, is the weather-sealed body, which means that no rain is gonna stop you from vlogging, no sawdust is gonna stop you from recording, and you're pretty much just ready to go all the time.
You have an awesome array of frame rates, you have nice video quality, which is to be expected from a camera at this price point, and if you like to do that sort of stuff, the camera has a mic output. Now to the cons of the Z50, most notably in my experience was the autofocus. I just couldn't get it to focus on me, and it's probably just user error, because I've seen Casey of Camera Conspiracies and many other YouTubers use this camera to create awesome looking content with a great image quality, but I for one could not get the camera to focus on me. No matter what speed I set the autofocus to, no matter what autofocus mode I used, I just couldn't get the camera to focus on my face. But with a face like this, can we really blame the Nikon? The articulating screen itself isn't a bad idea, but if you're vlogging with the Z50 and you're holding it out on a tripod, you're not going to be able to see anything on the screen since it's going to be behind the tripod. Now Nikon offer a separate base plate for the camera for the purpose of vlogging, which moves the tripod mount from the middle of the camera to underneath the grip, which not only looks awkward, but it's just another additional gadget that's going to cost you money. Also, when you have that base plate installed and you run out of batteries, you're going to have to unscrew the whole thing, switch out the batteries, screw it back on, put it on the tripod, and only then can you continue shooting. It's quite tedious. And its greatest weakness is also probably its greatest strength, which is the kinda new Nikon Z mount. If you're thinking about buying Nikon lenses, you're either gonna have to dive really deep into those pockets, because a Z mount standard zoom lens is gonna set you back something around 2K, and that's nearly 3 times the amount of money that you'd spend on the camera body itself. And we're talking about low budget options here, so that really is a bummer. Now you can get adapters for the Z mount, but in order to use the autofocus correctly, you'll have to get the original F to Z adapter provided by Nikon, which is also gonna set you back something around 250 to 300 bucks. So if you've got the extra cash laying around, just go for it. Maybe you can get the autofocus to work and you'll be really happy with the system. But for me personally, there were just too much flaws to settle with the Z50. Yup. Next up is the camcorder, the Sony AX53, which in the end turned out to be nothing more than a fun little experiment, but in the end that's gonna be up to you to decide. Now camcorders are best known for their ease of use. Just flip out the screen, hit record, and you're good to go. The camera will do the rest for you. But in order to shoot serious video, we'll have to be in control over all these variables that make up for the optimal exposure, as I've explained before. Now on paper, the AX53 seemed to check all those boxes. It has 8 megapixels, which is plenty for video. Even on most DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, you don't really utilize the whole megapixel range of the sensor to capture video. That's why you see some of the high-end professional camcorders sometimes sporting no more than 6 megapixels, and those are cinema-grade cameras. So for video, you definitely do not want to obsess over megapixels. So 8 megapixels, you have a 3-inch fully articulating LCD screen, you have contrast-based autofocus, which you can also switch to manual focus, you have a night shot mode, which is interesting, you have a 5-axis optical image stabilization called balanced steady shot, which is awesome. You can use focus peaking, you can display zebras to show all those overexposed areas, you have a hot shoe mount, you have a full-sized HDMI output, you have a mic input, and just as the Alpha 6000 you can capture motion picture in XAVCS cinema tone, which is awesome for grading and has a really great look to it. I hear people complain about the color science of Sony, especially for skin tones, but I don't think that was unworkable. Now sensor sizes in camcorders can be a bit weird, and this is no exception. It's a 1/2.5 inch sensor, which if you look it up is like super tiny. But you can shoot 4K in 25 and 24p, and you can shoot 1080p in 50, 25 and 24 frames per second. You also have the option of capturing a high-speed footage in 1080p, captured
at 100 frames per second, but again, it comes without sound. And of course it has the amazing zoom range that a lot of camcorders have. In this case, it's a 20 times optical zoom. Now the pros to using the AX53 is definitely going to be the ease of operation or the ease of use. There's reasonably high bit rates, which means there's gonna be a whole lot of information to utilize while color correcting and color grading. The image quality itself, thanks to Cinematone, is pretty good. Plus, once you start the record button, the stabilization engages and it's just the most stable handheld footage you can pretty much get. Now the cons to using the AX53 are pretty big. For one thing, to change the exposure on this camera, you can only navigate through the menu using the touchscreen, which is going to be really time consuming and you won't be able to change any values really quickly. And as I said before, you're only ever going to be able to change one value at a time. So if you want to change your shutter speed, both the aperture and the ISO are going to adjust accordingly. If you want to change the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO are gonna go haywire. And if you want to stick to a certain ISO level, your shutter and your aperture are gonna do whatever they want. So you're never gonna be able to fully control what you'll get out of this camera. Although the stuff you get out of it straight away does look pretty nice. In my opinion, this is a really expensive choice, considering that it's actually like a fancy point and shoot camera, but nothing you could really work to get some really nice looking footage like you would expect from platforms like YouTube. But then again, it's an all-in-one solution, so you're not really gonna need any great accessories to operate the camera itself. Just take it out of the box, insert the battery and an SD card, and you're good to go. So you gotta weigh that out. The last camera in this comparison, and during the vlog it kinda seemed like I was making fun of the system, where in reality I truly was. Cause I was so excited to work with a dual pixel autofocus camera, and I've never been so disappointed in my life. So let's talk about the Canon SL3 or 250D. It comes with a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, sports Canon's dual pixel autofocus, albeit only in 1080p. You have different color profiles to choose from, of which one is customizable. You can adjust the speed of the focus, and there's a few different focus modes to choose from, including face and eye detect, multi-area, and spot focusing. It can shoot in 4K with 25 and 24 frames per second, and it can shoot 1080p in 60, 30 and 25 frames per second. Now 24p? Yep, no 24p, they just left that out. So if you want to record in 24p, you're also going to have to record in 4K. And this is where shit really hits the fan. Because not only do you already have a 1.6 times crop due to the APS-C sensor, but the 4K mode adds an additional 1.6 times crop to that. Also, once you record in 4K, the dual pixel autofocus is gone and the Canon now works with contrast-based autofocus. The pros are it has dual pixel autofocus and it can shoot 4K in 24p. And the big list of cons starts with the dual pixel autofocus only working in 1080p, bespoke heavy crop in 4K, there's no optical image stabilizer, only electronic image stabilization. And as you saw in the vlog, that crops in even further. So altogether, if you're using 4K with the enhanced image stabilization mode, you're gonna get something close to a 4 times crop, and that is just mind-blowing. The body is not weather sealed whatsoever, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. You can get silicone covers for lots of camera bodies, including the 250D/SL3, but I'd rather have a weather sealing or dust and splash proof solution right out of the box. Now it has a fully articulating 3-inch LCD screen, but once you're outside and the sun is shining, chances are you're not going to be able to see anything on that thing. And even if you were able to see something on there, it can really only be used to check if your framing is correct. Because apart from focus peaking, there's no assist tools whatsoever. So there's no grid overlay, there's no histogram, there's no zebras, there's just a little exposure meter that's in every camera. And whatever is displayed on that exposure meter is gonna vary depending on which type of metering mode you choose. So if you chose center metering, for example, if you're in the center of the frame, are correctly exposed, even though the rest of the picture is completely blown out. So that's also pretty useless. It's a DSLR, so it's actually heavier than some of the other cameras that we've tried out. And like I said, there's no 24 frames per second mode in 1080p. While the M50 gets a lot of praise on the internet and has all the assist tools that are missing from the SL3, I chose to go with the SL3 nonetheless because of the lens mount. The M50 is an M-series camera which has the Canon M mount, and in my opinion the M mount lineup does not really have any interesting lenses that would be worth your time, or your money for that matter. So I chose to go with the SL3 in order to use some of the EF or EFS mount lenses without having to use adapters. Because adapters are the next big thing, and I got some for us to try out. So to make this quick and painless, I'll just run the test footage of most of these cameras with their respective lens adapters and speed boosters to mount EF glass on the Sony, on the Panasonic, and on the Fuji. So let's see how that went. So what we learned from that is that the only real way to use autofocus on any system is to use the native lenses. Because in the end, an adapter is just an additional piece of gear that's put between your lens and the camera body and is mostly gonna hinder information from the lens to the body and vice versa. But using one specific combination of camera, autofocus adapter and lens made all the difference in the world for me. And that is the Panasonic cameras with the autofocus adapter / speed booster and an EF lens. And why is it such a great combo? Because as you could see, the autofocus doesn't really think my face is worth focusing on. And like I said before, it's something that nobody really talks about. But in the year 2021, all cameras from all manufacturers have built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth and have some sort of app that goes with their own camera system. This little section here is gonna have less cuts than all the other stuff, just for me to try and show you guys what this app and lens adapter camera combination can actually achieve and why I think it's the main reason why you would probably want to get a Lumix camera if you're shooting yourself. So you're standing in your workshop all alone and you don't really want to rely on good luck for the focus to be on point and have the proper exposure. So Panasonic Lumix G80, Viltrox EF to micro four thirds, autofocus adapter, and a Tamron 17-50mm lens, constant aperture f2.8. My smartphone in hand with the Panasonic Image app installed and running. I have the camera set to manual focus, so if I come closer, I'm now gonna be out of focus. I should be out of focus. But what I can do right here is on this interface. Let me show you the interface a little better. You can't really see anything on the interface, huh? Well, let me just click here on the smartphone and focus on my and actually focus on the smartphone using the app. Now that's something you can't do with any other app or camera manufacturer. Canon, for example, has the ability. Now let's get back in focus right here. Canon has its own camera app, and you can control the focus via the app, but only using the autofocus. So you tap on the subject you want and let the camera focus. But here in this case, I can look at the image and I can manually set the focus area to wherever I want it to be. And that really is a game changer. So by utilizing this little gadget, you can have the camera set 30 feet over in that corner over there and still be able to check if your focus is correct and if your exposure is correct, because you can control everything from your smartphone, and that is awesome. And that is also the reason why I can wholeheartedly recommend the Lumix cameras, because as you might have seen in the vlog test, the autofocus works. It focuses on my face. Of course there's the odd pulsing in the background, but would you have noticed if I didn't tell you about it? And if you're doing talking headshots like I am right now, you'll probably end up using manual focus anyway, because you won't really move around here much. And even if you do move slightly, your plane of focus is gonna be wide enough to accommodate for the motion. Right now I'm shooting at f2.0 and I don't think the image has been destroyed by me moving out of the focus plane. So that was that. I'm glad you made it this far. I've worked on this video for far too long. In fact, it's been almost a month since I started recording for this. And I still have to get all the guitar building done. I still have to finish the workshop and all that sort of stuff. There's so much that I gotta do. So let me just quickly thank you guys for your attention. Leave a like down below, even if it's just to acknowledge the effort that I put into making this video. Hit that subscribe button if you thought it was actually helpful, and stick around to see if I can manage to actually do some good color grading in one of my future videos. Until then, I'm Kevin with Javelin Guitars, totally out of my comfort zone with a tech tutorial of sorts. Thanks for being here, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.